Chris Kilgore. I'm the lead pastor of Fair Forest Church of God in Spartanburg, South Carolina. We started this podcast and called it the Low Capacity Leader because most of my life in ministry and in leadership, I have seen high capacity leaders celebrated, and they should be. But I also know that there's a whole group of the rest of us who are not that way. And so I wanted to make something for the rest of us. A lot of this was birthed out of my desire to be able to say the things that I could not say on Sunday because I'm not good at creating a concise 30-minute statement in a sermon. So that birthed some of this, but also I believe there's a need for people to see that not everybody is doing 18 things at once. Some of us are just moving at God's pace of faithfulness for our lives. Next to me is...
I'm Amber C. I'm the associate pastor at Fair Forest, and I'm just here to help talk it out.
There it is, right there. So we're going to walk through the sermon from Sunday and then bring some questions up, and wherever that takes us, that takes us. So I hope it's valuable to you, and I hope you enjoy.
Enjoy.
Low Capacity Leader Podcast. This is episode 2 of what we started 2 weeks ago. So we had VBS at the church, and we always have the children's pastor preach on VBS Sunday. So kudos to Anna. By the time you see this, that will have already taken place. Thankful for all her hard work, and Lynn and all of that group that serves our children here at Fair Forest. So there were things that we did not really get to. A couple things that I really wanted to talk about regarding Genesis 13, the power of coming back and crying out, that first sermon in chapter 13 of Genesis about Abram. And so I wanted to come back to this, and there were a couple things I wanted to revisit, especially something that sort of landed on the cutting room floor it was on the Sunday morning that I preached this. And so that was kind of the purpose of this podcast for me, is to feel like I don't have to say everything because I'll have a chance to say all of the rest of the things. And
that's what it's for.
So we had started, so we ended up last time looking at a question that actually Pastor Isaiah, who is behind the camera right now, running all of this, thank you, Pastor Isaiah, for that. He had brought to us as he was processing things, and he had said, how can I recognize if I've resumed the right activities without renewing my relationship with God? And he went on to say, so you can be in the land without ever returning to the altar. And then the question became, how do you make sure that you check both boxes? You're in the land and at the altar. And so you had mentioned last time about the sons of Eli. Do you want to expand on that at all, just to kind of overlap those two?
Yeah, again, just tell of who they are,
who
they
were.
were.
A little bit of the story, sure.
The sons of Eli, they were really perverse. They perverted the altar. They didn't do their job. They were stealing really from God and the people. And they were in the temple. They were in the right place, but they absolutely were not calling on the name of the Lord. They were not, they didn't have the right heart posture. And Eli was letting them get away with it. And that's why, number one, Samuel became so important, because Eli realized that Samuel was hearing the voice of God, because Eli knew that his sons, nor him really, were hearing the voice of God anymore. So they were in the right place. It's just an example of them being in the right place, but not the right relationship, not at the altar, not at the feet of Jesus. So
absolutely. And I will say, I think there's a neat comparison between, because we're talking about being in two places. We're being in the right place and in the right heart posture.
Yes.
Right place, right posture would probably be an easy way to say that if you wanted to preach it like that. But
right place, right posture.
So Hophni and Phinehas versus... so you have the sons of Aaron and the sons of Eli, basically. Which are two very different stories. The sons of Eli were, as you said, completely perverting everything about the tabernacle. The sons of Aaron simply offered strange fire, which means they mixed the incense at the altar of incense wrong, and God kills them immediately. The sons of Eli, not so much. They get to do this until later on, and eventually they die. So I think that there's a fascinating sort of balance point there, where the more pure sort of the presence of God is in a place, the more the judgment of that place will purify.
Good. Yeah.
And I think sometimes we know that we're in the right place, that we haven't just come into the land, but we've come to the altar, because we feel the weight of what God is actually asking of us. We know that there are consequences to decisions. We know that there is gravity to what God has called us to. And I do think that there's a big difference between those two stories, but some of that is probably because, again, Eli had not heard the word of the Lord in a long time. Yeah, the presence of God was sort of declining. The candle was going out. Like there's all this imagery in 1 Samuel that's used to say that the same way that cloud of glory had descended into the tabernacle in Exodus was not the same way that glory was in the tabernacle in 1 Samuel. And so that it's hard sometimes, I think, but man, those places of pressure, when it's a good pressure, are not bad places.
No, yeah. I think it keeps you in check.
Yes.
Because, I mean, it's so beautiful because the closer you get to Jesus, the more that he's going to be like, this isn't right. Let me mold you here. This isn't good. Let me fix this. Let me purge this. But if you're standing at arm's length away from Jesus and you're not allowing him to be intimate and to be close, then how is he to help mold that? Right. How is he to help correct that if you're not giving him the opportunity?
Right.
So that's so good about pushing
guardrails, in. Guardrails take us further.
Yeah.
Guardrails they never limit us.
Yeah.
Because guardrails are only there to limit our life in the places where we're not supposed to go. Guardrails will never limit our life in the place that we are supposed to go. They always open roads toward the destination. They only close off access to the pitfalls and the problems and all of the missteps. And so I do think that Abram coming back to the altar, not just the land, there was gravity in that place, again, between Bethel and Ai, between the house of God and the place of ruin. Abram found that the presence of God was near in that place of surrender and sacrifice. So I do think that's part of it. I also, part of what I wanted to, so what hit the cutting room floor had to do with Luke chapter 14. I had typed out some ideas that Abram coming back to the Negeb from Egypt was a good passage about coming home. And really the first time when I added chapter 13, verse 1 to the end of chapter 12, I just talked about coming back home. Because I think that is an amazing resolution to that story. He comes back into the land. But it does not stop there. And not stopping at the borders of the land of promise is just as important as coming back to the land of promise. Yes. To not just kind of creep in over the edge, but to make sure that where I'm going is a place of purpose. And it never seems, in Genesis 13, 1 through 4, I never get the sense that Abram has any other plan. I never get the sense that Abram is just kind of wandering around. I was like, oh, I stumbled on an altar here. Like he knew he was going back to that place where God's presence had met him initially in chapter 12. And so that the story in Luke 14, which is a parable of Jesus, was really just swirling around my mind throughout last week as I was studying Genesis 13, which is how it is. So I'll just tell you, like this is, so to pull back the curtain a little bit, that is how my mind works. And I think a lot of people's minds work that way.
Yeah.
I am a bad enough presenter and probably dumb enough as a preacher to just, I'll engage a lot of those pathways, even though it's going to extend the sermon. Again, low capacity leader.
That's how you study. That's how you.
It is, but
that's
it's not
how
supposed to be how
learn
you
the word.
So, and then I'm not here running myself down. I'm just saying I think that's why this moment matters to me. I really felt the freedom to cut that because I said, I'm going to talk about this next week. And if nobody watches it, I don't care. I got to talk about it. So Luke 14, 28 through 30, this comes off of Jesus telling a parable about a great banquet. Then he talks about discipleship in the verses just preceding verse 28 in Luke 14. And then he tells this parable. He says, for which of you who desires to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it? Otherwise, when he's laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, and they say, this man began to build and was not able to finish. So just hearing this for the first time today, you didn't know that this is where we were going before like 5 minutes ago. Your initial reaction to why that might have been, because this is just me playing now, why that might have been in my mind when I'm thinking about Genesis 13, Abram coming into the land, into the altar. I'm putting you on the spot. I'm sorry.
You are, and at first I couldn't find what verse you were at, and I have to see to hear, and so then I got distracted because low capacity here. So I'm trying to reread. For which of you desiring to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation, is not able to finish. All who seek begin to mock him. I think if your brain went here with Abraham and his life and what you've already talked about the journey of faith, or you're talking of the journey of faith, but that's why you started, discussing Abraham, is to go through his life, not just the big points, just like you had stated last time. So if your brain brought you here, for which of you desiring to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost? Because we talked about that, like counting the cost and counting the risk, right? Like we talked about that in the last podcast. So I could see where your brain would go with this, because you knew Abraham was counting the cost of this. And yes, he was a sojourner and he knew where he was supposed to go, but he also knew that he had a promise.
That's good.
And so he's having to make sure that he's walking in the completion of this promise, and all the mistakes that he's made and will make, but he's still trying to complete that which Jesus had stated.
Absolutely.
So
yes. I was looking for a story in the New Testament to support what I was saying in the Old Testament, because I always want to,
You're really well at that. I'm not.
Well, that's I start with the Gospels and everything else is after them.
Yeah.
So when I read the Bible, I read the Gospels and then read everything outward, because Jesus changed everything. And so when I read this, and there's a whole series of parables in Luke 14 here. This is not the only one, but this is the first one of the group. I think it was the idea that there was a completion. So when I go back to, and again, it's in the previous podcast, but when I was reading about the Zeigarnik effect, this idea that we want to check boxes and we want to finish things, we want to complete things, and failures in our life create a gap in our ability to feel like we have completed a thing because we can't go backward in time.
Yeah.
So this idea of completion, Jesus is talking about, not just completion. He says, anybody who builds a tower wants to finish it, but what Jesus says is, if there is not a counting of the cost, if there's not a casting of vision so that I know exactly what I'm trying to build, what it's going to cost me, then there is a high rate of probability that eventually people are going to mock me. And their mocking in verse 30 of Luke 14 is, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Yeah. And I think that's that idea of failure. Abram started a journey from Haran, made it into the promised land, then left and went to Egypt, went to a place that was not a part of God's plan for him. He began to build, but then he went away from it. So the mocking of verse 30 in Luke 14 falls on Abram's head while he's in Egypt. What is the antidote for that? And I think it is what's in verse 28. Jesus gives us the answer. At the beginning of this story, he says, if you don't have a vision for what you're actually trying to do or trying to become, then you will never know how to finish the project or finish the journey. Abram knows that the altar is the place. That is what defines success in his journey.
It's the beginning and the ending of it.
And exactly the process, right. When he goes back up that mountain in Genesis 22, and he takes his son up that, he's taking him to an altar.
Yeah.
Like the most profound moments of Abram's life are at altars. God is always leading him to altars, because the land of promise is a land that is filled up with places to offload what I could not deal with myself, to surrender and to sacrifice, both in worship and for healing.
And you never quit the altar.
Never. It will never become a past tense thing. Yeah. And so what's unique, and so this is the part that I geek out on in some of these passages. In Luke 14, in verse 28, when Jesus says that the person who wants to build will count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it or complete it, that Greek word is apartismos. In verse 30, where it says the mocking of the crowds when they say, oh, this guy began to build and he could not finish it, that is a different Greek word, is the Greek word ekteleo. They're two different things. So what is powerful is Jesus says in verse 28, the word for finish in verse 28 is a noun that literally means the full completion or settlement of a project. So he says, you have to know what the finish line looks like, or else you're not really in a race. You're just running. And until you know that there's a mountain you want to climb, you will never be able to start the climb. That is at the front end of this parable. Jesus says you've got to know. So Abram coming back into the land knows where he's going. He's not just going back into the Negeb. He's journeying through there because the altar is where he's trying to get to. And if the altar is where we're trying to get to, the place of the presence, the place of God's taking this stuff from us, the place where I can surrender and submit all of the past failures, then I actually have a destination that's worth pursuing. The mocking then is a different Greek word. Ekteleo is not a noun, it's a verb. So when the people who are mocking this half builder when they start to talk, they say he began to build, but he was not able to carry the task through to its final end. So the execution of a journey is based on the vision of the end of the journey. Without the vision of the end of the journey, you cannot execute to the end of the journey. If Abram wasn't heading to the altar, he was never going to accidentally wind up at the altar.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think it was this part of me, and again, this is the excitement. Like, if we can't measure where we're going, then we can never actually execute the process of getting there.
Yeah.
And Abram is not just stumbling upon an altar. Abram is heading toward an altar.
Yeah.
And so practically, I think that's where I wanted, and I did. I tried to passionately express this on Sunday. If the altar becomes a place of shame instead of a place of sacrifice and surrender, then the altar will be a place that we either avoid or never intentionally pursue, because it's the place that brings up my past instead of the place where I can finally release my past.
Yeah,
and so the vision of those places of surrender, I've got to be clear in my mind, because if the enemy of my mind, my life, can convince me that altars are places of brokenness in a way that causes me to stumble again or just rehash old failures, instead of a place that God has actually designed to be a place of freedom and liberty that the Spirit brings me to and utilizes, then I've already lost before I've begun, because I've never really begun.
Yeah, that's true. I think that altars, I always try to think how altars are. It's a story in the Old Testament, and my brain just kind of went blank about where it was, but they were altars for remembrance. They were to mark.
When Joshua crosses
Yes,
over the Jordan.
Joshua. Thank you. Yeah. It was to mark. Like, we're going to remember this. And I think so many times, like in the Old Testament, you have like with Noah, when the water went down and they finally stopped. Like the altar, he built an altar, and I think to keep away from that shame of an altar is if we are constantly pursuing a life with Jesus, like we're constantly pursuing this. And like you had said yesterday, or when you had preached this, that it's not, the altar doesn't have to be the steps at the church.
Yeah.
Like, it's in your car, it's in your home, like when you're taking a shower, whenever you're praying, like whenever you're going back to, because there's moments in my life where I look back and I remember where, like, I made that spot an altar. Like, this was what, like, the Lord was doing this right here in me. Like, this is what he had spoken to me, and I needed to sit down at his feet. Not that I don't sit down at his feet regularly,
Sure.
But I think in order to keep out the shame of that, of the altar, is to remember what the Lord had done. Like, we're an overcomer by the blood and by the word of our testimony, right? So if the altar becomes a testimony, the altar is like, yes, I went through this here, but this is why I went to the altar. Like, yes, I was about to sacrifice my son, but God supplied, like at this altar.
Yeah.
Like, instead of it being, I was going to have to sacrifice my kid, it is God provided for my kid.
Right.
So like if we could, again, it's like a mindset shift. Like, the altar is not a place of shame. The altar isn't a place to hang your head. The altar is a place where Jesus lifts our head.
Yeah. Well, because he is, and again, in a New Testament sense, he is the ultimate sacrifice.
Yeah.
So when I come to the altar, there's already blood on it.
Yeah.
Like, when I come to the altar now, it's already bloody. It doesn't require me to go through all of this agony. He went through the agony on the cross. And I think the beauty of that, what you just said, and what Abram's life is then pointing toward. Obviously, when you get back into the 20s and when he, when God provides the ram for Isaac and all of this stuff, that altar then becomes a beautiful picture of Christ and the gospel. But the idea that God is always bringing him back to these places to remind him. So even before there's blood on this altar, there's already presence in that place.
Yeah.
And the presence of that place is there to do what needs to be done.
Yeah.
It is there to absorb the past failures. Abram gives it to him, leaves it behind, lets it go. And God said, that's why I brought you back here. And it's just beautiful. Like, and that,
that's even in Genesis. When they were hiding, when Adam and Eve, or we're in Genesis, so
yes, we
in
are.
Genesis with
Just
Adam
further
and
back,
Eve, when Adam and Eve were hiding, like, God made a sacrifice. His presence was still there. He still came to be with them. Like, his presence was there, but he made a sacrifice. He, like, built an altar for them, and then obviously promised the better sacrifice later on. But his presence is always there. It's just making, and the sacrifice has already been there with Jesus. It's just making it known, Like, why are you there?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I think sometimes
That's
people
good.
get
That's
aggravated with that question of like, well, what do you need? Like, what is it? Why are you here? Why am I at this altar?
Yeah.
What brought me to this point? And how am I going to walk through this point?
Yeah.
You know, like he never brings us to a place without getting us through it, you know? So
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And I think it's important because at some point, if we don't, and I harp on this again, I think I did it last time when we were talking through all this, if we fail to see the altar as a place of freedom,
yeah.
if we continually see it as a place of condemnation, then we're the ones who miss out.
Yeah.
We miss out on what God has provided for us. And that will never be all right because God's desire for us is freedom. The Spirit of the Lord brings liberty. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. And I do think what you said is beautiful. God was not unaware of Abram. God was not distant from Abram. When Abram crosses just back into the border of the country, God's there. God's with him. But it's that Abram went to a place.
Yeah.
It's not that God had to go to an altar. It's that Abram came to an altar because the intentionality of that journey. And again, I think that's what Jesus is saying in Luke 14. The intentionality of the building project requires you to know I'm not just trying to get over the border, I'm getting back to the altar.
Yeah.
And when that's my goal and I get all the way there, what happens is beautiful. What happens is I complete the project. The journey is something that I'm actually on and I'm not just running and expending energy without any purpose. That vision of the altar and of the place of sacrifice and surrender is the antidote for so many things that we deal with. So many practical things that we fight and we wrestle with and we struggle with and we don't like to say out loud. That is because, again, it's not just, God, I need your presence or I need to feel the tingle when the key change happens in the worship song. Like it's, God, I'm coming back to a place intentionally.
Yes, intentionally
with you.
Yes.
So a couple of things I have in my notes here that I wanted to say. So casting a vision of surrender as a place of liberty, which again is ironic in its own way, in the way that it's stated. But it's important because you will never accidentally ascend to integrity. You will always accidentally slide into compromise.
Yes, that's so true.
If there is no intention, you will never accidentally become a person of integrity, wholeness, or healing.
That's right.
You will absolutely become a person accidentally of compromise and sort of a wishy-washy life that sometimes is good and sometimes is not. And so I talked some about that, yesterday with that, or in the sermon. Are we defining what we're called to, and are we calling on the name of the Lord? Those two things.
Because I think it matters. Without vision, people perish, right? And I think that goes not just for church bodies, not just for congregation. I think it goes individually. I think it goes with households.
100%.
Like, because a house divided won't stand.
Correct.
Why is the house divided? Because the vision doesn't line up.
Correct.
Because you're not aligned. And I think that it matters being able to see, being able to count the cost, being able to finish it is because you need to have, what is God asking of you? What are you called to?
Yeah.
And are you calling on the name of the Lord? Because if you don't know, and that's not saying that we have to know our every move and what God is wanting, because there's a lot of stepping out in faith.
Absolutely.
But why are you stepping out in faith?
Right.
What brought you to that, to step out in faith? Like, where is he leading you in a manner of your relationship with him? It's not always about the position or the location of the move or whatever, but like, what is he leading you to? And are you open to his words in that vision? Like, you don't have to have this 5-year plan for this church of 200 in order to say that you have a vision. What you need to do to have a vision is say, am I following after Jesus, and am I being obedient?
That's good.
And am I shepherding the flock in the manner that he has asked me to? Because that's the vision. He's called you to be a shepherd over his flock. So, okay, what does that look like? How do I? And
I grew up in a church that was obsessed with shadows. I grew up in a time when people were completely consumed with what is the end going to look like? And, what is the beast of Revelation? Like all of what's it going to look like? Which nation is it? I get all that. I do understand some of that stuff. But I think to a degree, when we're obsessed with things that we cannot know, it sometimes is really just a strategic replacement for doing the things that we already know.
Noah didn't know.
He did
You
not.
know, like what would have
Just
happened
build,
if he would have paralyzed himself because he didn't know?
Sure.
He didn't know what rain was. He just knew that he was building this thing with mechanisms that God had told him to, with measurements that God had told him to, and he had no idea. So, but if he would have paralyzed, you know, like been struck in fear of knowing, well, I don't have a vision, so I can't move forward. Your vision is following after Jesus, following after God who told you these words.
Well, I think if we had spent 30 years pursuing obedience to the Sermon on the Mount instead of trying to find out who the Antichrist was, I think the church would be a lot better off.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's my own soapbox, and so that's why this podcast is what it is. And some of you probably just turn it off because you're irritated with me, and that's okay. I'm all right with that. But like,
it's true. We don't have people who know what an altar is because we're worried about the rapture and lightning striking us. So it's true.
No, it's true. So what are you building? And then get a vision for that building. Have people even defined what discipleship is? Like, do we even define it? Have we set those goals to say, I know it's going to cost this. I know daily it's going to cost this. Or are we just shocked when somebody says you should be praying every day?
Yeah.
Or you should be opening the Word of God regularly. Like, it's like, why? Isn't that why I go to church?
What
like,
is
no,
that
that's
cross?
not why you go to church. So like that's what discipleship is. And I think the reason then that there is this mocking and accusation that, oh, look, they started to build but didn't finish, is because we've been so blind to what it actually looks like to build the thing that God has called us to build.
Yeah.
What does following Jesus look like? Now, some of that's a willful blindness, because I do think that Jesus is real clear in the Gospels what it actually looks like. Paul says some things that we have to, like, I beat my body into subjection daily. You're like, okay, well, I don't like the way that sounds. So what if I just go back to another verse? But that's what I think part of Luke 14 is talking about. And it's what Abram did that allowed success to take place.
Yeah.
He said, we're not going into the land, we're going to the altar.
Yeah.
I know my destination, and that means I'm going to get there because I'm going to exert the energy necessary to get to that place where the presence of God actually is.
Yeah, and you brought up a couple of weeks ago, too, about carrying your cross, and you're like, the cross that you're carrying, like these people are like, oh, I'm carrying my cross. You know, but like, are you though? Like, are you praying, or are you carrying a cross that's really making you an enemy of the cross? Right. Because it talks about that. Like the New Testament talks about being an enemy of the cross. Like if you really dive into what that is, like, are you carrying a cross, or are you just carrying a victim mentality and not discipleship and not what the word says, and just this? Well, are you finishing are you going to the altar?
There's an alignment. If Jesus called me to carry my cross, Jesus did not do that so I would be in bondage to it.
Yes.
Jesus called me to carry a cross because that probably means that I'm not going to be able to carry everything else in this world, which will weigh me down and keep me from being free. And so I think we see it. It's a place of death. Obviously, you're carrying a cross. It's the means of execution. It would have been a shocking statement in Matthew chapter 16 when he told his disciples that. Obviously, like,
because they knew the context and the culture of it.
Carrying, a lethal injection. I'm not carrying an electric chair. But what's powerful is that I think he does make it so clear that I'm leading you to life.
Yeah.
And the only way to get there is to, perhaps anyway, to be so burdened with the good things that I'm giving you that you cannot have any more room for the burdens of the world that are trying to suffocate and destroy you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that, so, you're right. People have become victims and they've complained about what they're going through instead of celebrating what God has given them to carry, which means we've gone from, I once was blind, but now I see, to, well, I'm still blind, but I'm in Jesus' arms. Like, that's not the same thing. And so there's this beautiful freedom for someone who actually has a vision for their life. They are not confused anymore. Clarity has come. Doesn't mean they know everything, but they know what they need to know.
Yeah.
Because they have counted the cost of the building project in front of them.
Yeah.
And nobody's going to look at them and say, they started to build, but they didn't finish. It's like, no, I know what I'm building, which means I have counted the cost and I know what it costs to get there. So I do.
There's been different like moments in my life where I'm like, this is fully an assignment. Like this is what this means, and this is what he's calling me to. And then there's been other moments in my life where I'm like, I don't really see it, but I hear you, and I'm taking each step as you say. And I think that's okay. But to be at the altar in both scenarios.
Yes, absolutely.
To be coming back in prayer, both scenarios. Yep. To be in his word, both scenarios. Because if you're just in the land and not at his feet, coming back to an altar, then you might as well stay off on the other side of the border.
Yeah. Why would you?
Yeah.
Why are you coming back?
Yeah.
Again, you're getting all the, really you're getting all the worst parts and none of the best parts. And so that's exhausting. So you brought it up. We had internally in here, I've already mentioned Pastor Isaiah behind the camera. In between these two, we had talked about prayer a little bit. And so just to show the cards a little bit in this, it is difficult sometimes to apply texts as a preacher, as a minister, as a teacher, even as a discipler or as a mentor. Sometimes it's difficult to look at somebody and say, okay, here's the 3 applications for your life. Here's the 3 things you can go do this afternoon and everything's going to get better. Some people are really good at boiling those down and giving people action steps. But I think some passages just aren't that way. And that doesn't mean that there's not an application, because what I talked about was simplicity, the simplicity of the gospel, the simplicity of Christ. If I'm following and pursuing him, then there's a simplicity that sets me free in that. And the 2 things that changed Abram's life from chapter 12 to chapter 13, it's only 2 things. He came back to the land and the altar of the land, and he called on the name of the Lord. He prayed. Yeah. And so what we were kind of, I guess, I don't know, we're laughing through the pain of it, not just laughing, haha, but laughing like, oh, this is great, is that they're sometimes the only application, if you want to follow Jesus, is you just get into a place and you just keep yelling at him and you keep listening to him and you keep praying until something changes. And it's such an unsatisfying application, because it's like, well, but I want to add 5 minutes to my morning and everything be better. It's like, no, there's some moments when you're just going to have to get to a place where nobody else is. Yeah. And you say, God, like old Jacob, Abram's grandson, and say, God, I'm not letting go. Yeah. I will not let go, because I don't have any other option here other than to take hold of you and to let it all out in your presence. And I'm expecting you. I need you to do something. That kind of prayer doesn't apply well in a sermon, because people don't want to hear that. They want to hear better, quicker, faster, cheaper answers. But the only way, I think, sometimes to peace and freedom is that.
Yeah. I'd rather walk away with a limp in the presence of the Lord than not be in the presence of the Lord at all.
Because what happens in the presence of the Lord?
He wraps you in.
Wholeness, freedom.
Yes.
All the things you're actually looking for only happen in those places. Yeah. And so I guess, and this is one of those preacher things, I think the longer I do this and the older I get, the less pressured I feel to bring a bunch of application to a sermon. I know that it's necessary sometimes. And it's great because there are some box checkers who need that. They need to walk away saying, I've got this action item. I've got this next step. But sometimes I think the answer is, here's who God is. Here's the character and presence of God. Here's how you find it. Now just run. Yeah. Jesus did not say to the disciples, I got 3 years. Here's all the steps. Here are the cities we're going to go to. Here's what it looks like to give up the miraculous catch and follow me. He just says, come follow me.
Yeah, just do it.
Because there's some things you can only, I think Oswald Chambers had this really great line, says there are some things you can only learn in a fiery furnace. Like there's some things you cannot learn outside hoping to plan your way through the fire. Yeah. There's some things you can only learn because you stepped into that place, because you believe God was there and you said, okay, I'm going to find out what's in here, or I'm going to die trying. Like that is the only way that works. Yeah. And I think with Abram, he says, I'm going back to that altar. God might not be there, but that's where I know he was. I'm not just coming into the land. I'm going back to that place where I met with him, and I'm going to call on his name, and it changes everything for him. Yeah. So it doesn't say how long he was there. It doesn't say how long he was at the altar. It just says that that's where he went. And by the time life started to shift and the conflict with Lot was brought up, he was not the same man as he was when he left for Egypt. Transformation happens in those places.
That's true. That's true. It reminds me of Peter. If was stepping out of the boat, people harp on him for looking down, but he was the only one that stepped out. He was the only one that said, if that's you, I'll go. In this water. I mean, when we think of that, almost like a fairy tale story, but they were real people saying, okay, I'm going to literally get out of a boat with sea waters. Yeah. And I think that I myself am about to walk on this water. It wasn't just some fairy tale like Peter Pan flying you over Neverland. Correct. It was, he's stepping out and to be in the presence. And whether he took his eyes off for a moment and whether he denied him later on, there was this altar moments for him.
Yeah,
And it
yeah.
never states that Peter built an altar per se,
Right.
but he went fishing again.
Yeah.
He came to breakfast.
Yeah.
He, like there was moments for Peter where even Jesus was like, I prayed for you, because Jesus himself became that place for
Absolutely.
Peter. And
But that's the key. And so I think Peter's building project, what he was counting the cost for, was not to be able to walk on water.
yeah, it was
His
just to be
building
with
project
Jesus.
was to get to the presence.
Yes.
Because Jesus meant everything. And when
Yes.
Jesus means everything, you'll find that things happen along the way that you couldn't have anticipated, that are amazing, that are miraculous, that are
Yeah.
beautiful, that are challenging. But the goal was never that thing.
Yeah.
Like the goal is never the miracle. The goal is never a bigger building. The goal is never more money. If the goal is Jesus, then
Yes.
the goal is set. That's the building project. Can I follow him? Can I get closer to him?
Yes.
Can I pursue him? And I just think, there's this part of me that wonders. And I know I'm really stretching the text a little bit. But the water could never have been the same for Peter.
Yeah.
It never. Once you've walked on it, that place is not the same. And I just half wonder, and it's sort of just my own musings, I just half wonder if when he realized it was the Lord in John 21, if he doesn't jump out of that boat to see if he's going to stand up.
Can I walk on this?
Maybe he's not just trying to swim to get there first and fastest. Maybe he's testing those waters again because he remembers what happened on those waters.
Yeah.
But the storm was inside of him, not on the waters that day.
Yeah.
And so he did walk on stormy waters. It just was a stroll with Jesus away from the fire after he
Yeah.
come to the shoreline. But I just wonder, you can't be the same.
No.
Like that will never feel the same because of what happened while you were chasing Jesus. You're building that relationship. That is what we count the cost for, not everything else. So,
Yeah.
and
Presence
I've
matters.
lost my timer, so I have no idea how far into this we are. I'll say this, and I'll close here. We took communion after this because we take communion once a month at the church. It is really my plan. So if you're a Fair Forest person watching this, it's my plan to end up taking communion every week at some point. But I'm just prayerfully trying to see what season that is. But if you are having to watch this because you know me as a pastor and I'm just your friend, you don't go to the church here. If you lead a church, have communion more often than you think you should.
Yeah. Because it matters.
Open the elements more often than you think you should. I grew up doing it 2 or 3 times a year, and I think we missed a beautiful opportunity to tie the scriptures back to Jesus on a more continual and regular basis. The point of the story of Abram is not Abram, it's Jesus. The
Yes.
point of the story of the Exodus is not the Exodus, it's Jesus. The point of David's life is not David, it's Jesus. And if it's not coming back to that place regularly, very regularly, if not weekly, then more regularly than usual, then we're probably just giving people a lot of wisdom, but we're not giving them salvation and gospel. And so I would highly recommend do it more.
Yeah.
Open up the elements. Take communion. It doesn't have to be flashy. It doesn't have to be this huge altar call where everybody floods forward and people are, speaking in tongues and giving prophetic words. Sometimes you just come back to the table because the table is an altar. And that table that is an altar might just be the thing that sets people free and releases the prophetic word in their mouth and releases their heart from condemnation and gives them peace of mind so they can be who they're supposed to be. Take communion more often. It
Yes.
matters. It matters. That's just me as a pastor imploring any other leader in the church who might have made it this far in the podcast. Do it more than you're doing it right now. You will not regret it ever. So I'm good.
good.
You all right?
Yeah.
I think I've exhausted the things I wanted to talk about.
No,
but I
you're
did get
good.
to talk about on Sunday. And for low capacity leaders, it matters that we get to say those things.
Yes.
So thank you for joining us. I don't know what this send-off is supposed to look like. I'll close this as awkwardly as humanly possible because it makes me happy to do things really weird.
That's what he does.
Yes, it can be. It can be. The awkward cat is in the house. And I hope that you have a great, whatever day this is for you.